Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of history's most terrifying scenarios. Picture this. You're living peacefully in 9th century Europe, perhaps a monk copying manuscripts in a quiet monastery, or a farmer tending your fields by the coast. The morning mist rolls off the water, birds are singing, and life feels simple, safe, predictable. Then you see them. Dark shapes emerging from the fog, long, sleek vessels cutting through the water like predators. And aboard those ships, warriors, whose very name would strike fear into hearts for centuries. The Vikings have come to raid. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because by the end of this story, you'll understand why a Viking raid wasn't just an attack. It was a carefully orchestrated nightmare that most people couldn't survive. Not for a day, not for an hour, sometimes not even for minutes. It's dawn. On the English coast, somewhere around 793 AD, your brother Ethelred, a monk at Lindisfarne Priory, one of the holiest sites in all of Christendom. Your day begins like any other. Matins at midnight, lauds at dawn, then to the scriptorium to continue copying the Gospels. The monastery sits on a tidal island, connected to the mainland only at low tide. It feels safe, protected by God and geography alike. But as you step outside to tend the herb garden, something catches your eye. Dark shapes on the horizon moving against the wind. Your first thought is merchant ships, perhaps bringing pilgrims or trading goods. But there's something wrong about the way they move. Too fast, too purposeful, too many. These aren't merchant vessels, they're long ships. And aboard each one are 30 to 60 warriors who have spent weeks, maybe months, planning this exact moment. They've studied the tides, mapped the coastline, and chosen their target with surgical precision. This isn't random violence. This is warfare perfected over generations. The ships themselves are marvels of medieval engineering, though you have no way of knowing that as you watch them approach. Each long ship is roughly 70 to 100 feet long, shallow drafted enough to navigate rivers and land directly on beaches. They're powered by both sail and oar, making them incredibly versatile. When the wind fails, 40 oars bite the water in perfect synchronization. When the wind blows, a massive square sail propels them at speeds that would make Roman galleys weep with envy. You squint across the water, trying to count them. 5 ships. Maybe 6. That means anywhere from 150 to 360 warriors heading directly for your peaceful monastery. And you, brother Ethelred, are about to experience something that will redefine your understanding of human brutality. The ships don't announce themselves with horns or shouts. They approach in eerie silence, like wolves stalking prey. The only sounds are the whisper of water against hulls and the rhythmic splash of oars. This silence is deliberate. It's part of the terror. By the time you realize what's happening, it's already too late to mount any meaningful defense. You run toward the bell tower, thinking to warn the other monks, but even as your feet pound across the cobblestones, you know it's futile. The ships are less than half a mile out now, and at their current speed, they'll beach in minutes. There's nowhere to run. The mainland is a mile away across mud flats that are impassable at high tide. The monastery has no walls, no soldiers, no weapons beyond a few eating knives and farm tools. As you reach for the bell rope, you catch your first clear glimpse of the approaching raiders. Even at this distance, you can see the glint of metal. Axes, swords, spear points catching the early morning light. Some of the warriors have painted their shields black, a psychological tactic designed to strike fear into their enemies. Others bear the image of ravens, wolves, or serpents. The lead ship has a carved dragon head at its prow, eyes painted to stare directly at you. Later, historians would call these ships drakar, but right now all you see is a sea monster rising from the waves, filled with men who look more like demons than humans. You pull the bell rope with desperate strength. The bronze bell rings out across the island, its voice carrying panic and prayer in equal measure. But even as the sound echoes off the monastery walls, you know it's not a call to defense, it's a death knell, because in less than 10 minutes, these warriors will be on the beach, and your peaceful world will become a slaughterhouse. The other monks emerge from their cells, confused and frightened. Brother Cuthbert, elderly and frail, clutches his walking stick. Brother Oswald, barely 18 and new to monastic life, looks to you for guidance you don't have. The abbot appears, his face grave but determined. He's old enough to remember tales of earlier raids on Irish monasteries, but this is the first time the storm has come to England. "Gather what you can," the abbot says quietly. "The sacred books, the reliquaries, hide them in the crypts." But you all know it's too late. The ships are close enough now that you can see individual faces, hard faces, weathered by salt spray and scarred by battle. Some of the warriors are older, grizzled veterans with greybeards braided with silver rings. Others are young men, barely out of adolescence, but their eyes already hold the cold calculation of killers. And then you notice something that makes your blood freeze. Some of the warriors aren't preparing weapons or adjusting armor. They're working themselves into a frenzy, beating their shields with axe handles, chanting in their harsh northern tongue. Their movements are becoming erratic, animalistic. These aren't just soldiers. These are berserkers, warriors who believe they can channel the spirit of bears and wolves in battle. The lead ship's dragonhead is now close enough that you can see every carved scale, every painted detail. Behind it, the other ships spread out in a perfect line, their approach coordinated with military precision. This isn't a chaotic mob, this is an organized assault force, and you're about to learn why Viking raids were so devastatingly effective. Brother Oswald grabs your arm. "What do we do?" he whispers. You look at his young face, still soft with the sheltered life of monastic peace, and realize you don't have an answer. Because there is no good answer. You can't fight them. You're monks, not warriors. You can't flee. You're trapped on an island. You can't negotiate. Vikings don't negotiate with their prey. The only thing you can do is pray that death comes quickly. As the ships prepare to beach, you catch a glimpse of something that will haunt your final moments. The warriors aren't just armed for battle, they're prepared for what comes after. You can see lengths of rope, iron shackles and empty sacks. They're not just here to kill, they're here to take whatever and whoever might be valuable enough to sell in the slave markets of Dublin or Kiev. The first longship grinds against the rocky beach with a sound like grinding bones. Warriors leap into the shallow water, not even waiting for the ship to fully beach. They're moving with practiced efficiency, spreading out to secure the landing zone and prevent any escape. And that's when you realize the true horror of your situation. This isn't the beginning of a battle. This is the end of your world. Everything you've known, everything you've believed about safety and sanctuary and the protection of God is about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The Vikings have arrived, and your hour has begun. The first warrior to reach the beach moves like something not quite human. His eyes are rolled back, showing only the whites. Foam flecks his beard. He's stripped to the waist despite the morning chill, his pale skin covered in intricate tattoos and old battle scars. In his right hand, he grips a massive two-handed axe, its iron head darkened with what you desperately hope is rust, but suspect is dried blood. This is a berserker in the full grip of his battle fury, and you're about to witness something that medieval chroniclers would struggle to describe without sounding like they were inventing fairy tales. The berserker charges up the beach, not toward the monastery, but toward a small fishing boat pulled up on the shore. With a single swing of his axe, he reduces the boat to kindling, but he doesn't stop there. He begins attacking the pieces, chopping and hacking at the wood with mechanical fury, each blow accompanied by wordless howls that sound more animal than human. You watch in horrified fascination, unable to look away. This isn't strategic destruction. This is something else entirely. The berserker is working himself into an even deeper trance, using the violence to feed his fury until he becomes, in his own mind and that of his enemies, something beyond mortal concern. Behind him, more warriors land, but these move with cold, professional efficiency. They form a loose line, shields overlapping, advancing steadily toward the monastery. These are the career soldiers, the men who've turned raiding into an art form. They're not in a trance. They're completely aware, completely in control. And that makes them infinitely more dangerous than the berserker. You try to count them as they emerge from the ships, but the numbers become meaningless. 30, 40, 50 armed men spreading across the beach like a tide of iron and leather. Each one represents more combat experience than your entire monastery has ever possessed. Each one has killed before, probably many times. Each one knows exactly what he's here. You try to count them as they emerge from the ships, but the numbers become meaningless. 30, 40, 50 armed men spreading across the beach like a tide of iron and leather. Each one represents more combat experience than your entire monastery has ever possessed. Each one has killed before, probably many times. Each one knows exactly what he's here to do. The berserker finishes destroying the boat and turns his attention toward the monastery. His eyes, when they focus on you across the distance, show no trace of recognition or mercy. You are not a person to him. You are prey. The transformation is complete. Whatever humanity he possessed before the fury took hold is gone, replaced by something that believes itself to be a bear, a wolf, or a raven sent by Odin himself. But here's what makes the situation truly hopeless. The berserkers aren't just uncontrolled animals. They're weapons, carefully deployed by commanders who understand exactly how to use terror as a tactical advantage. The other warriors give the berserker space, forming a loose circle around him as he begins his final approach. They're not afraid of him. They're using him. You see, berserkers weren't just wild men who got lucky in battle. They were elite warriors, carefully selected and trained. To become a berserker, a man had to prove himself in combat many times over. Then came months, sometimes years, of preparation involving ritual meditation and the consumption of various substances that modern historians still debate. Some say it was alcohol, others suggest hallucinogenic mushrooms. A few believe it was simply the power of suggestion and intense psychological conditioning. But whatever the method, the result was undeniable. In battle, berserkers felt no pain, showed no fear, and fought with a fury that broke enemy formations before the main force even engaged. They were shock troops, psychological weapons designed to shatter morale and create chaos in enemy ranks. As the berserker approaches the monastery, you notice something that makes your situation even more desperate. He's not alone. Two more warriors are working themselves into similar frenzies on the beach. One is beating his shield with an iron-headed mace, the rhythmic pounding growing faster and more frantic. The other has begun a strange jerky dance, his movements becoming increasingly violent and erratic. This is a coordinated psychological assault. The Vikings didn't just stumble upon terror tactics, they perfected them over generations. They understood that fear could be more effective than swords, that a reputation for supernatural fury could win battles before they even began. The advancing line of normal warriors begins to pick up pace, their shields locked together in what they call a shield wall. But this isn't the tight, disciplined formation you might expect from Roman legions. This is something more fluid, more adaptable. The Vikings have learned to fight in small groups, to break apart and come together as the situation demands. They're not just raiders, they're marines, specialized in rapid assault and quick extraction. Brother Oswald tugs at your sleeve. "We should run," he whispers. "Into the woods, maybe we can hide." But you know better. The woods Brother Oswald is thinking of are 3 miles away across open ground. Even if you could somehow get off the island, even if the tide were low enough to cross the mudflats, you'd never make it. These warriors have been planning this raid for weeks. They know the terrain, the tides, the escape routes. They've done this before many times. More importantly, you're not dealing with a mob. You're dealing with professional soldiers who've turned raiding into a science. They know exactly how to prevent escape, how to herd their victims, how to maximize both terror and profit. Running would just make your death more painful and protracted. The berserker reaches the monastery's outer courtyard and pauses, tilting his head like a predator scenting prey. For a moment, the terrible howling stops, replaced by an even more unnerving silence. Then he smiles, and you see that his teeth have been filed to points, a common practice among berserkers meant to enhance their wolf-like appearance. Behind him, the main force of raiders begins to spread out, cutting off every possible escape route. Some head for the boats pulled up on the monastery's small dock. Others move to surround the main buildings. A few begin examining the bell tower, probably calculating how best to get to the bronze bell itself, which represents a significant amount of valuable metal. But it's the berserker who holds your attention, because he's started moving again, and his target is clear. He's heading directly for the main chapel, where morning prayers are still in progress. A handful of monks who didn't hear the bell, or who chose to trust in God's protection rather than flee, are kneeling before the altar. You want to shout a warning, but your voice catches in your throat, because you realize that warning them would be pointless. There is no escape, no defense, no rescue coming. The ships on the horizon have landed, and now there's only the question of how quickly the end will come. The berserker kicks open the chapel door with such force that it splinters off its hinges. The sound echoes across the courtyard like thunder, and the other raiders pause in their advance to watch what comes next. This too is part of the psychology. They want you to see what happens to those who resist, who pray, who believe God will protect them. What happens next will haunt you for the few minutes you have left to live. The berserker disappears into the chapel, and for a moment there's an eerie silence, broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. Then the screaming begins. Not battle cries or war shouts, but the raw, desperate sounds of unarmed men facing sudden, brutal death. You're about to learn why Viking weapons weren't just tools of war. They were instruments of terror, designed not just to kill efficiently, but to break the will of anyone who witnessed their use. The primary Viking weapon, the one you'll see in the hands of most raiders, is the battle axe. But this isn't the massive two-handed weapon you might imagine from Hollywood movies. Most Viking axes are single-handed affairs, perfectly balanced, with heads that curve from a narrow edge at the back to a broad, razor-sharp blade at the front. They call it a bearded axe because of the way the lower portion of the blade extends downward like a metal beard. These axes are devastating in ways that swords simply aren't. A sword thrust requires precision, skill, and the right angle to penetrate, mail or thick clothing. An axe, on the other hand, delivers its force over a smaller area, concentrating tremendous power behind a sharp edge. It can split shields, crush helmets, and cleave through bone with terrifying ease. More importantly for raiders, axes are versatile tools. The same weapon that can split a man's skull can also break down doors, smash open treasure chests, or hack. Through rope and leather, Vikings don't carry separate tools for different jobs. Every piece of equipment serves multiple purposes, and the axe is the perfect example of this efficiency. But the psychological impact of the axe is just as important as its practical effectiveness. There's something primal and terrifying about being attacked with what is essentially a refined version of humanity's oldest tool. It speaks to fears buried deep in our ancestral memory, the terror of being hunted by predators with cutting implements. The screaming from the chapel stops abruptly, replaced by the sound of splintering wood and crashing metal. The berserker is destroying everything inside, not just killing the monks, but obliterating the sacred space itself. This isn't random vandalism. It's deliberate psychological warfare designed to demonstrate that nothing is sacred, nothing is safe, and no god can protect his followers from Viking steel. As you watch the chapel door, paralyzed by horror, you become aware of movement to your left. 3 raiders are approaching your position, moving with the casual confidence of hunters who know their prey has nowhere to run. The lead warrior carries a sword, not an axe, and that somehow makes him even more terrifying. Viking swords are not crude weapons. They're masterpieces of medieval metallurgy, some of the finest blades ever forged. The best ones, like the famous Ulfbert swords, are made with crucible steel imported from as far away as India or Central Asia. These weapons are flexible enough to bend almost double without breaking, yet hard enough to hold an edge that can cut through mail links. The sword approaching you is pattern welded, its blade showing the distinctive snake-like patterns created by folding and refolding steel during the forging process. The hilt is decorated with silver inlay, and the pommel bears runic inscriptions that might be the smith's name, the sword's name, or magical formulas meant to enhance its cutting power. This is not just a weapon. It's a work of art, an heirloom, possibly worth more than your monastery's entire annual income. The man carrying it is not a common soldier. He's someone important, probably a jarl or a ship's captain, someone wealthy enough to afford the finest weapons and experienced enough to use them with deadly skill. Behind him, the other 2 warriors carry spears, another weapon that demonstrates Viking tactical sophistication. These aren't crude, sharpened sticks. They're carefully balanced weapons with iron heads attached to ashwood shafts. The heads are designed with wings or lugs that prevent an enemy from pushing forward along the shaft after being stabbed, and some have hooks designed to catch and pull down shields or grab weapons. Viking spears come in different varieties for different purposes. Some are designed for thrusting in close combat, others are weighted for throwing. A skilled warrior can kill at 20 paces with a thrown spear, or fight effectively in the shield. Wall with a thrusting spear, switching between techniques as the battle demands. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating weapon in the Viking arsenal is the one you haven't seen yet, the seax. This is a single-edged knife, anywhere from 6 inches to 2 feet long, carried by virtually every Viking warrior as a backup weapon and general-purpose tool. The seax is intimate in ways that axes and swords are not. It's used for close quarters, fighting, for finishing wounded enemies, for cutting throats and taking trophies. It's the weapon of last resort and first choice for the kind of brutal, personal violence that raids inevitably become. As the 3 warriors close in on your position, you notice details that make your situation even more hopeless. Their mail shirts, if they're wearing them at all, are supplemented with leather and padding that provides protection without sacrificing mobility. Their shields are round, made of lime wood with iron reinforcement, painted with designs that mark their allegiance and intimidate their enemies. But it's their casual confidence that's most unnerving. They're not rushing, not shouting, not working themselves into a frenzy like the berserker. They're simply walking towards you like farmers approaching livestock, discussing something in their harsh northern language and occasionally laughing. You realize they're talking about you, debating perhaps whether you're worth taking alive as a slave or whether you should simply be killed out of hand. The decision they're making will determine whether you die in the next few minutes or spend whatever remains of your life in chains, but to them, it's just another minor tactical consideration. The lead warrior, the one with the pattern-welded sword, calls out to you in broken Latin. "Monk," he says, his accent thick, but his meaning clear. "Wear gold, wear silver." This is your first indication that these raiders are not just mindless barbarians. They've done their research. They know that monasteries accumulate wealth, that sacred objects are often made of precious metals, that monks sometimes serve as bankers for local nobles. This raid isn't random violence. It's an armed robbery carried out by professionals who've studied their target. You try to answer, to tell him that your monastery is poor, that you have no gold, but your voice comes out as a croak. Fear has closed your throat, made your tongue thick and useless. The warrior laughs, not unkindly, and says something to his companions that makes them chuckle as well. They've seen this before, many times. They know the signs of a man facing his first experience of real violence, and they find it amusing rather than concerning. You are not a threat to them. You are barely even an inconvenience. The berserker emerges from the chapel, his axe now slick with blood, pieces of torn vestments clinging to his hair and beard. He's covered in what looks like gold dust, the ground-up remains of illuminated manuscripts, sacred books that took months to create and represent centuries of accumulated knowledge. He sees the 3 warriors talking to you and shouts something in Norse that makes them laugh. Then he throws back his head and howls like a wolf, the sound echoing off the monastery walls and seeming to summon more raiders from the ships. You're surrounded now, completely cut off from any hope of escape. But the worst part isn't the weapons, or the warriors, or even the certainty of death. The worst part is the growing realization that this isn't personal. You're not the target of these men's hatred or the victim of their passion. You're just business. And business for the Vikings is very, very good. What you're witnessing isn't chaos, despite how it might appear. It's a carefully choreographed military operation that has been refined over generations of raiding. The Vikings didn't become the terror of medieval Europe through random violence. They became legends through systematic scientific brutality. The 3 warriors who have cornered you represent different elements of the Viking tactical system. The sword-bearer is clearly the leader, probably a seasoned jarl who's commanded dozens of raids. The spear carriers are his huskarls, professional warriors who've sworn loyalty to him personally and fight as a coordinated unit. While they hold you in place, you can see the larger operation unfolding around the monastery with military precision. Teams of 2 or 3 raiders are systematically searching every building, not randomly looting, but following a clear plan. Some head for the kitchen and storerooms, looking for food and drink that can sustain the crew on their journey home. Others make straight for the workshop areas, seeking iron tools that can be melted down or traded. But it's the group heading for the scriptorium that demonstrates the Vikings' sophisticated understanding of value. They're not illiterate barbarians, destroying books out of ignorance. They know exactly what they're looking for: illuminated manuscripts with gold leaf, silver clasps on book covers, jeweled reliquaries, and carved ivory pieces. These items represent portable wealth that can be easily transported and sold in markets from Dublin to Constantinople. The leader of your captors calls out in Norse, and immediately several other warriors begin converging on your position. But
they're not coming to help capture you, they're coming because the sword bearer has identified something valuable. You see, monks in the early medieval period weren't just religious figures. Many were educated, literate, and came from wealthy
families. A captured monk could be ransomed back to his family or sold in the slave markets for a substantial sum. Your simple brown robes and tonsured head mark you as potentially profitable merchandise. The approaching warriors form a loose circle around you, but their positioning isn't random. Each man stands where he can watch a different approach route, creating overlapping fields of vision that make surprise attack impossible. More importantly, they're positioned so that if you somehow broke free, you'd run directly into the weapons of the men behind you. This is basic, small unit tactics, the kind of formation discipline that takes months of training to perfect. These men have fought together before many times. They know each other's strengths and weaknesses, can communicate with glances and gestures, and move as a single organism when necessary. But the real demonstration of Viking tactical sophistication is happening at the monastery's small harbour. While the main force conducts the raid, a reserve team has remained with the ships, not just guarding them, but preparing for a rapid departure. They've turned the longships around so the prows face the open sea, loaded supplies and equipment in a specific order that allows for quick access to essential items, and positioned the ships so they can launch even if the tide turns unexpectedly. This isn't amateur hour. This is the medieval equivalent of a modern military operation, complete with contingency planning, clear command structure, and specialized roles for different team members. The berserker who destroyed the chapel has rejoined the group, but his fury has cooled into something even more dangerous: cold professionalism. Without the battle trance, he becomes what he really is: an elite warrior with decades of combat experience who can kill you in dozens of different ways without working up a sweat. He approaches the sword bearer and speaks rapidly in Norse, gesturing toward the bell tower. You catch enough Latin loanwords to understand that he's reporting what he found in the chapel: some silver, a few small treasures, but nothing spectacular. The monastery is poorer than they hoped, which means they'll need to extract maximum value from other sources. That's when the sword bearer looks at you with new interest, not as a person but as a commodity. He walks around you slowly, examining your hands for calluses that might indicate manual labor skills, checking your teeth to estimate your age and health, assessing your overall condition like a horse trader, evaluating livestock. This clinical examination is more terrifying than the berserker's fury because it strips away any pretense that you're dealing with human beings driven by passion or rage. These are businessmen conducting an inventory, and you're just another asset to be evaluated, processed, and monetized. The sword bearer says something to one of the spear carriers, who produces a length of rope from his pack. Not just any rope, but a specifically designed restraint with loops and knots that suggest considerable experience in binding prisoners. This isn't improvised. They came prepared for exactly this situation. As they begin to tie your hands, you notice other details that speak to the systematic nature of Viking raiding. The warriors are working in shifts, with some resting while others maintain security. They're drinking water from leather bottles, not ale or beer, keeping their minds clear for the work ahead. Their weapons are clean and sharp, their equipment
Maintained to professional standards. More importantly, they're keeping track of time.
The sun is climbing higher, and the tide is beginning to turn. Every Viking raid operates under strict time constraints. Stay too long, and you risk being trapped by changing tides, arriving enemy forces, or deteriorating weather. The key to successful raiding is getting in, taking what you came for, and getting out before the situation can turn against you. You're watching a masterclass in medieval military efficiency. These warriors have reduced violence to a science, calculating risk versus reward, optimizing their tactics through generations of experience, and turning terror into a precision
Instrument. The rope burns your wrists as they bind you, but the physical pain is nothing compared to the psychological horror of understanding exactly how doomed you are.
You're not facing wild barbarians or random criminals. You're facing the medieval equivalent of special forces operators, professionals who've turned raiding into an art form, and you're completely, utterly, helplessly outmatched. The sound of splintering wood echoes across the courtyard as another team of raiders breaks into the monastery's treasury. They work with practiced efficiency, using iron bars and axes to pry open locked doors and smash through reinforced chests. But they're not just destroying everything they can't immediately carry, they're making calculated decisions about what's worth taking and what should be left behind. This selectivity reveals another layer of Viking tactical sophistication. They understand logistics, weight limitations, and market values. Every item they choose to carry back to the ships represents a careful calculation of effort versus potential profit. As your captors finish binding you and begin marching you toward the harbor, you pass other monks who've been captured or killed. The scene is organized, almost methodical. Bodies are stripped of anything valuable before being left where they fell. Prisoners are bound and grouped together for easier management. Treasures are sorted and packed according to a system that suggests considerable experience in this type of operation. You're not witnessing random violence. You're seeing the end result of a sophisticated military culture that has spent centuries perfecting the art of profitable warfare. And you're about to become a very small part of their very large business model. As the raiders march you toward the ships, your mind races through possibilities that all lead to the same conclusion. You're trapped in a situation where every choice is wrong. Fight, and you die quickly. Run, and you die slowly. Surrender, and you spend whatever remains of your life in chains. There are no good options, only different forms of disaster. But let's explore what would happen if you somehow found the courage to resist, if some desperate surge of adrenaline convinced you to try fighting your way out. After all, you're not completely helpless. You're a young man in reasonable health. You have the advantage of knowing the monastery's layout, and there are farm tools scattered around that could serve as weapons. The moment you try to break free, several things happen simultaneously, all
Of them bad for you. First, you discover just how much stronger these warriors are than you anticipated. The average Viking raider is built like a medieval equivalent of a special forces operator. Years of rowing, fighting, and manual labor have
given him functional strength that goes far beyond what you could develop copying manuscripts and tending gardens. When the spear carrier grabs your arm to stop your escape attempt, his grip feels like an iron manacle. You might as well try to break free from a bear trap. Second, you learn about the speed gap between trained warriors and civilians. Vikings fight for a living. Their reflexes are honed by countless battles, their movements economical and precise. You've never thrown a punch in anger, never had to dodge a weapon, never experienced the brutal physics of hand-to-hand combat. The moment you make an aggressive move, you're operating in their world, and in their world, you're an infant facing professional killers. Let's say you somehow manage to grab a shovel from the garden and swing it at the nearest raider. What happens next? He doesn't dodge dramatically or stumble backward like an actor in a play. He simply steps inside your swing, catching your wrist with one hand while driving his knee into your solar plexus with surgical precision. The shovel drops from your nerveless fingers as you fold over, gasping for air that won't come. But that's just the beginning. While you're doubled over trying to breathe, the raider behind you brings his spear butt down on the base of your skull, with exactly enough force to drop you without causing permanent damage. They don't want to kill you yet. You're worth more alive than dead. But they need to establish dominance and discourage further resistance. As you hit the ground, tasting blood and dirt, you experience something that no amount of prayer or scholarly study could have prepared you for: the reality of medieval violence. It's not noble or glorious or fair. It's brutal, efficient, and utterly one-sided. These men have reduced combat to a craft, and you're not even an apprentice. The sword-bearer says something in Norse that makes the others laugh, probably commenting on your pathetic attempt at resistance. Then he kneels beside you and speaks. In that broken Latin again: monk, foolish. Try again. Monk, dead. Understand? You understand. Fighting is suicide. These warriors have been killing people since they were teenagers. They've fought in dozens of raids, survived ship battles in North Sea storms, and faced down enemies who actually knew how to use weapons. You're not a threat to them. You're barely an inconvenience. But what if you tried to run instead of fight? What if you somehow slipped your bonds and made a break for the woods or the water? Surely your knowledge of the local terrain would give you some advantage. The short answer is no. The longer answer is that Vikings are very, very good at hunting humans. Remember, these warriors didn't just sail randomly to your coast and hope to find something worth stealing. They've been planning this raid for weeks or months. They've studied the tides, mapped the coastline, and identified escape routes. More importantly, they've done this before many times, and they know exactly how panicked civilians behave when faced with armed raiders. If you somehow broke free and ran toward the mainland, you'd be running across mud flats at low tide with no cover and nowhere to hide. The raiders would have plenty of time to catch up with you, either on foot or by launching one of their smaller boats. Vikings are excellent runners. They have to be, since their fighting style involves rapid movement and quick repositioning. And they're much better conditioned than a monk who spends most of his time sitting at a writing desk. Even if you reached the woods, your advantages would disappear quickly. Vikings are skilled hunters and trackers. They live in forests, navigate by stars, and find their way across featureless oceans. Following the trail of a frightened monk through familiar woodland would be child's play for men who regularly track deer and elk through Norwegian mountain forests. More importantly, running would just make your eventual capture more violent and unpleasant. Raiders who have to chase down escaped prisoners tend to be less interested in preserving their market value. If they catch you after a lengthy pursuit, you're likely to be beaten severely, possibly crippled, and sold as damaged goods rather than premium merchandise. But the real reason running is hopeless lies in something you couldn't possibly understand: the psychology of predator and prey. Vikings are apex predators in the world of medieval warfare. They've spent their entire lives hunting, fighting, and raiding. When they see someone run, it triggers deep instincts that go back to humanity's earliest days as persistence hunters. They don't just chase you, they enjoy chasing you. The pursuit becomes sport, a brief entertainment between the serious business of looting and killing. You've seen cats play with mice, And that's essentially what you'd become, a toy for warriors who find genuine pleasure. In the hunt, as you lie on the ground, your failed escape attempt fresh in your memory and your body aching from the casual violence of your recapture, you're forced to confront a terrible truth. There is no heroic option here. There's no clever plan, no desperate gambit, no last-minute rescue. You're completely at the mercy of men who view mercy as a business decision rather than a moral obligation. The sword-bearer pulls you to your feet with one hand, his grip strong enough to leave bruises. He examines the cut on your forehead where you hit the ground, not out of concern for your welfare, but to assess whether the damage affects your sale value. Satisfied that you're still marketable, he nods to his companions and they resume the march toward the ships. As you stumble forward, hands bound and head throbbing, you pass the results of other prisoners' escape attempts. Brother Cuthbert, the elderly monk who tried to hide in the bell tower, lies crumpled at the base of the stone steps. His walking stick is broken beside him, suggesting he tried to defend himself with a piece of carved wood against men carrying iron weapons. The outcome was predictable. Near the chapel door, you see Brother Oswald, the young monk who wanted to run to the woods. He made it perhaps 50 yards before being tackled by a raider who barely looked winded by the chase. Now Oswald sits with his hands bound behind his back, blood streaming from his nose, his eyes wide with the shock of discovering that the world is far more violent than his sheltered upbringing had led him to believe. These aren't cautionary tales. They're demonstrations. The Vikings are showing everyone exactly what happens to those who resist, making it clear that cooperation is the only option that doesn't end in immediate death. It's psychological warfare refined to its most effective form. But even cooperation isn't really an option because you're not dealing with people who view you as human. You're livestock now, valuable only as long as you remain healthy enough to work or command a good price in the slave markets. The moment you become more trouble than you're worth, you'll be disposed of as casually as they might discard a broken tool. This is the ultimate horror of your situation. Not just that you're helpless, but that your helplessness is exactly what these warriors expected and planned for. They've done this so many times that they can predict with near perfect accuracy how their victims will react, what they'll try, and how quickly they'll break. You're not the first monk they've captured. You won't be the last. You're just another transaction in a business model that has made Viking raiders wealthy for generations. The ships that brought death to your monastery are now preparing for departure, but they're not the same vessels that arrived at dawn. They're lower in the water, heavy with stolen goods and human cargo. What you're about to experience is the medieval equivalent of a slave transport, and it will make your morning's terror seem almost gentle by comparison. The raiders have been efficient in their selection process. Not every monk is worth the trouble of keeping alive. The very elderly, the seriously injured, and anyone who showed too much resistance during capture have been left behind, their throats cut with businesslike efficiency. You and 6 other survivors represent the cream of the crop, young enough to work, healthy enough to survive the journey, and potentially valuable enough to justify the food and water you'll consume on the voyage home. As they force you aboard the lead longship, you get your first close look at Viking naval architecture. The ship is a marvel of medieval engineering, but from your perspective as unwilling cargo, its most notable features are the things designed to carry people who don't want to be there. Iron rings have been bolted to the ship's ribs, providing secure anchor points for chains and ropes. The cargo area amidships has been fitted with a wooden grating that can be locked from above, creating a makeshift prison hold. Most tellingly, the ship carries far more rope and restraints than any merchant vessel would need, clear evidence that human trafficking is a regular part of their business model. They chain you to one of the iron rings along with the other prisoners, using shackles that show the wear patterns of frequent use. The iron is cold against your skin, and already you can see how the metal has rubbed raw spots on your ankles. This is going to be a long, painful journey, and it's only just beginning. The ship's captain, the sword-bearer who examined you earlier, begins barking orders in Norse. The crew responds with practiced efficiency, but there's an urgency to their movements that wasn't there during the raid. They're operating under time pressure now, racing against the tide, the weather, and the possibility that word of the attack has reached other monasteries or local lords. As the longship pushes off from the beach, you catch your last glimpse of the monastery that was your entire world just hours ago. Smoke rises from several buildings, including the chapel where you celebrated morning prayers. Bodies lie scattered across the courtyard like discarded rags. The bell tower stands empty and silent, its bronze bell already loaded aboard one of all. The other ships, everything you knew, everything you believed about safety and sanctuary and divine protection, lies in ruins behind you, and ahead lies nothing but the vast grey expanse of the North Sea and whatever fate awaits you in the slave markets of Scandinavia or beyond. The rowing begins immediately, 40 oars biting the water in perfect synchronization. The ship moves with surprising speed and grace, but the motion that seems smooth from the outside feels very different when you're chained in the bottom of the hull. Every wave sends you sliding against your restraints. Every change in course throws you against the other prisoners or the rough wooden ribs of the ship. You're beginning to understand why the raiders were so selective about who they kept alive. This journey is going to be a test of endurance that not everyone will survive. The weak, the injured, the elderly would have died within days of this treatment. By killing them quickly on the beach, the Vikings actually showed a form of mercy, though you doubt they saw it that way. The other prisoners are in various states of shock and despair. Brother Marcus, the monastery's treasurer, keeps muttering prayers in Latin, but his words are lost in the sound of wind and waves. Brother Paul, who worked in the scriptorium, stares at his hands as if he can't believe they're chained. Brother Thomas, barely 20 years old, weeps silently, tears mixing with the salt spray that crashes over the ship's low sides. None of you speak. What is there to say? You're all facing the same fate. Slavery in a foreign land, separation from everything and everyone you've ever known, a life of forced labor for people who see you as property rather than human beings. But it's the casual attitude of the crew that's most disturbing. To them, this is just another day at the office. They row with steady rhythm, make adjustments to the sail as the wind shifts, and chat among themselves as if they're not carrying a cargo of human misery. One of them even starts singing a rowing song that helps keep the oars in time. This isn't
An aberration for them. This is normal. They've turned human trafficking into a routine business operation, as mundane as hauling timber or trading fish. You and your fellow monks aren't victims of unusual cruelty.
You're just the latest shipment in a trade network that spans from Greenland to Constantinople. As the ships clear the coastal waters and head into the open sea, the full scope of your situation becomes clear. You're not just being taken somewhere, against your will. You're being removed from the world entirely. The England you knew, the life you lived, the person you were, all of that is disappearing behind you, becoming smaller and smaller, until it's just a smudge on the horizon, and somewhere ahead, across weeks of open ocean, lie the slave markets where your new life will begin, if you survived the journey. The captain walks back to check on his human cargo, examining each prisoner with the same clinical interest he showed earlier. When he reaches you, he crouches down and speaks in that broken Latin again. Monk read. Monk right? You nod, not sure whether literacy will improve or worsen your situation. His smile suggests it might be valuable, but you're learning not to trust Viking smiles. They tend to precede unpleasant surprises. Good, he says. Monk worth more, live longer. It's the closest thing to reassurance you're likely to get, but it comes with its own horror. You're worth more because you're educated, because you can serve as a clerk or accountant or translator for whoever buys you. Your years of scholarship, your devotion to learning and faith have qualified you for a higher grade of slavery. The irony is lost on the captain, but it's devastating to you. Everything that made you who you are, everything you worked to achieve in your religious life has been reduced to a line item on a Viking balance sheet. Your value as a human being is now measured in silver, and your education is just another marketable skill. As the longship settles into its rhythm for the long journey ahead, you close your eyes and try to pray. But the words that once brought comfort now feel hollow. The God who allowed this to happen, who let these pagans destroy his house and enslave his servants, seems very far away indeed. You're beginning to understand that your hour in a Viking raid was just the beginning. The real test of endurance is about to start, and it's going to last for the rest of your life. As the longship cuts through the grey waters of the North Sea, you have time to think about what you've experienced, and slowly you begin to understand something that chills you more than the salt spray and ocean wind. What happened to your monastery wasn't just a military operation or even a business venture. It was psychological warfare of the highest order, designed not just to extract wealth, but to spread terror far beyond the immediate victims. The Vikings didn't just want your gold and silver, they wanted your fear. Consider the timing of the raid. It came at dawn when people are least alert, most vulnerable, but more than that, it came during morning prayers, deliberately targeting the most sacred moment of the monastic day. This wasn't coincidence. The raiders knew exactly when to strike for maximum psychological impact. They could have waited until later, when the monks were scattered across the island attending to various duties. They could have struck at night, using darkness to mask their approach. Instead, they chose the moment when their victims would be gathered together in prayer, completely defenseless, trusting in divine protection that would prove utterly inadequate. The
message was clear. Your God cannot protect you.
Your prayers are worthless. Your faith is an illusion. Nothing is sacred. No one is safe. But the psychological manipulation went deeper than just timing. Every aspect of the raid was designed to maximize terror and minimize resistance. The berserkers weren't just there to fight, they were there to break the will of anyone who witnessed them. The calculated destruction of the chapel, the systematic looting of sacred objects, the casual violence against defenseless monks, all of it was theater, designed to create such overwhelming horror that resistance would seem impossible. Think about how the raiders moved through the monastery. They didn't just kill everyone and burn everything down. That would have been simpler. But the most insidious aspect of Viking psychological warfare is how it corrupts the very idea of resistance. You've seen what happens to people who fight back, and the lesson is clear. Fighting is pointless. The Vikings are too strong, too fast, too well trained. Any attempt at resistance just prolongs the agony and increases the violence. This learned helplessness isn't an accident. It's a carefully cultivated response that makes future raids easier. Towns that have heard stories about Viking raids are less likely to resist. Local lords are more likely to pay tribute rather than risk confrontation. Monasteries might even pay protection money, essentially funding the very raiders they're trying to avoid. You're beginning to understand that what happened to you wasn't personal. It wasn't even really about your monastery's modest wealth. You were chosen as participants in a larger strategy, a campaign of terror that extends across all of medieval Europe. Your suffering serves a purpose that goes far beyond the immediate profit from your capture and sale. The Vikings have weaponized fear itself, turning it into a tool more effective than any sword or axe. They've created a reputation so terrible that the mere sight of their ships on the horizon can cause entire towns to evacuate. Kings pay tribute to raiders they've never even fought, simply to avoid the possibility of experiencing what you've experienced. And the beauty of it, from their perspective, is that it's self-reinforcing. Every successful raid adds to the legend. Every story of Viking brutality makes the next target more likely to surrender without a fight. Terror becomes currency, more valuable than gold because it can be spent over and over again. As you sit, chained, in the bottom of the long ship, listening to the raiders laugh and sing as they row toward home, you realize you've become part of this machinery of fear. When you're eventually sold in some distant slave market, when you're forced to work for Viking masters, when you inevitably die far from home in chains, your story will become part of the legend. Other monks will hear what happened to Brother
Ethelred, and they'll be just a little more frightened, a little more ready to surrender when the dragon ships appear on their horizon.
Your suffering will make their conquest easier, more profitable, more complete. This is the true genius of Viking warfare. They don't just defeat their enemies, they break them. They don't just take wealth, they create the conditions that make future wealth easier to take. They're not just raiders, they're architects of terror, building a system that feeds on itself and grows stronger with every successful attack. And you, Brother Ethelred, are both victim and accomplice in this system. Your capture adds to their wealth. Your suffering adds to their reputation. Your story adds to their power. The salt spray hits your face as the ship rides up over a larger wave, and you realize you're crying. Not just from fear or pain or grief for your fallen brothers. You're crying because you understand now that your hour in a Viking raid was never really about survival. It was about becoming a weapon to be used against the next monastery, the next village, the next group of innocent people who believe God will protect them from the fury of the north. The sun climbs higher as the long ship settles into its journey, and you're forced to confront another disturbing truth about your captors. These aren't wild berserkers drunk on battle fury or savage barbarians driven by bloodlust. They're businessmen, and you've just become a very carefully calculated investment. Listen to how they talk among themselves as they row. Even though you don't speak Norse, you can hear the rhythm of negotiation, the cadence of deal-making. They're discussing markets, prices, potential buyers. One points to Brother Marcus and says something that makes the others laugh, probably commenting on his age and the limited market for elderly slaves. Another examines Brother Paul's hands, noting the ink stains that mark him as a scribe. You're not people to them, you're inventory. Walking, breathing commodities to be transported, maintained, and sold for maximum profit. And they're very, very good at this business. The ship carries specific supplies for human cargo, extra water rations, dried meat that can keep prisoners alive without wasting valuable fresh provisions, and even a crude medical kit for treating injuries that might affect
Sale value.
They've done this before many times, and they've refined the process through experience. The captain makes regular inspections of his human goods, checking for signs of illness, injury, or despair that might indicate a prisoner is unlikely to survive the journey. This isn't compassion, it's quality control.
A dead slave is worthless, but feeding a prisoner who's going to die anyway is a waste of resources. You watch him evaluate Brother Thomas, the youngest of your group, who's been weeping steadily since the raid began. The captain crouches down
and examines the young monk's face, checking his eyes, feeling his forehead for fever. He speaks a few words in broken Latin, trying to determine if Thomas is physically ill or just emotionally broken. The distinction matters because emotional trauma can be overcome, but disease can spread to other prisoners or crew members. If Thomas was showing signs of plague or fever, he'd be thrown overboard immediately. But tears and despair are manageable problems that don't affect market value. Satisfied that Thomas is merely devastated rather than diseased, the captain moves
on to examine you.
His hands are surprisingly gentle as he checks your bonds, not out of kindness, but because rope burns and circulation loss can damage the merchandise. He adjusts your shackles slightly, giving you just enough relief to prevent permanent injury. Monk.
Strong, he says, in that broken Latin. Monk, valuable. Monk, no die. It's a promise and a threat in equal measure.
You won't be allowed to die, but you also won't be allowed to live as anything more than property. Your survival is guaranteed only as long as it serves their profit margins. As the hours pass, you begin to see the full scope of the Viking slave trade. This isn't a small operation run by a few desperate raiders. It's an industry, a complex economic system that spans continents and involves thousands of people at every level. The raiders themselves are just the front end of the business, the acquisition specialists who gather raw materials. Behind them lies a vast network of transporters, dealers, markets, and end users who form the backbone of medieval slavery. Your eventual sale will generate profit for ship captains, harbour masters, market officials, and countless middlemen who've never held a sword but profit from the violence of others. Even the route the ship is taking has been chosen for commercial reasons. The captain isn't just sailing home to Scandinavia. He's following established trade routes that connect with other merchants, other markets, other opportunities to maximize profit. Your journey will likely include stops at multiple ports where some prisoners will be sold and others acquired, building the most valuable cargo possible for the final destination. But the true horror of the slave trade isn't just its scale. It's its sophistication. These aren't simple criminals grabbing whatever they can get. They're professionals operating according to well-established business principles. They understand supply and demand, risk assessment, quality control, and market differentiation. Young, healthy men like Brother Thomas will be sold for agricultural labor or construction work. Educated prisoners like you and Brother Paul will command higher prices from buyers who need clerks, translators, or tutors. Brother Marcus, despite his age, might be valuable to someone who needs an experienced administrator. Even the monasteries, gold and silver will be distributed through specific channels designed to maximize profit while minimizing risk. Every aspect of the operation is designed for efficiency and profit. The weapons they carry are chosen for their versatility in both combat and cargo handling. The supplies they bring serve multiple purposes. Even the terror they spread serves a business function by making future raids easier and more profitable. You're witnessing the dark side of medieval commerce, the part that doesn't appear in histories of trade routes and market towns. For every merchant ship carrying silk and spices, there's another carrying human beings torn from their homes and families. For every peaceful transaction in a bustling market square, there's another taking place in chains and despair. The Vikings didn't invent slavery, but they've perfected it as a business model. They've turned human trafficking into an art form, combining military efficiency with commercial sophistication to create a system that generates enormous wealth for relatively little risk. And you're not just a victim of this system, you're proof
of its effectiveness. A few hours of violence at your monastery will generate months or years of profit for dozens of people.
Your life, your knowledge, your labor, all of it will be converted into silver and goods that flow through the vast economic networks of medieval Europe. The ship rides up over another wave, and you feel the spray of salt water on your face. It tastes like tears, but you're not crying anymore. You're just beginning to understand how thoroughly you've been reduced from a human being to a commodity, from a servant of God to a unit of profit in someone else's ledger. The business of blood is very, very good, and you're about to become a permanent part of its supply chain. As the long ship carries you further from everything you've ever known, imagine for a moment that you're not Brother Ethelred, medieval monk accustomed to hardship and deprivation. Imagine instead that you're a modern person, someone from the 21st century who's somehow found themselves facing a Viking raid with nothing but contemporary sensibilities and suburban survival skills. You would be dead within minutes. Not because modern people are weaker or less courageous than their medieval ancestors, but because everything about modern life has prepared you for a world that no longer exists. Your reflexes, your assumptions, your entire understanding of how violence works has been shaped by a civilization where actual physical brutality is rare and usually controlled by authorities. When the long ships appeared on the horizon, a modern person's first instinct would be to call for help. Reach for a phone that doesn't exist to contact police who won't be invented for centuries. The cognitive dissonance alone, the inability to process that no one is coming, that there are no authorities, that you're completely on your own, would freeze you with indecision at exactly the moment when action might save your life. But let's say you overcame that initial shock and tried to fight. Modern people know about violence, right? We've seen movies, played video games, watched martial arts demonstrations. Surely that knowledge would help. It would get you killed faster. Everything you think you know about combat comes from entertainment, designed to look dramatic rather than function effectively. Real medieval violence is nothing like movie fighting. There are no extended duels, no dramatic pauses, no opportunities for clever one-liners. A Viking warrior would kill you before you finished assuming a fighting stance you learned from watching action films. Your body itself would betray you. Modern life has given you many advantages, but physical resilience isn't one of them. You're probably stronger than a medieval monk in some ways. Better nutrition, medical care, and controlled exercise can build impressive muscles. But you've never experienced real hunger, real cold, real physical desperation. Your pain tolerance has been calibrated by a world with anesthetics and emergency rooms. The moment you took a real blow from a Viking axe, the moment you felt bone break or saw your own blood flowing freely, your nervous system would go into shock. Medieval people lived with pain as a constant companion. An infected tooth, a broken bone, a deep cut. These were inconveniences to be endured, not medical emergencies requiring immediate professional intervention. But for you, the physical trauma would be overwhelming. You'd panic, freeze up, or pass out at exactly the moment when you needed to keep fighting or running. Your soft, modern body would simply shut down when confronted with the kind of casual brutality that medieval people accepted as a fact of life. Even if you somehow survived the initial contact, you'd face challenges that would finish you quickly. Medieval people were accustomed to sleeping rough, eating spoiled food, drinking questionable water, and going days without bathing. Your digestive system, used to processed foods and filtered water, would rebel at the first taste of whatever slop the Vikings fed their prisoners. You'd probably die of dysentery before you ever reached a slave market. Your social conditioning would also be a fatal liability. Modern people are taught to respect authority, follow rules, and expect fair treatment from institutions. You'd keep waiting for someone to explain your rights, to provide due process, to treat you according to some standard of human decency. But Vikings don't have human resources departments. They don't follow Geneva Conventions that won't be written for 1,000 years. They don't care about your feelings, your rights, or your expectations of fair treatment. Your property now. and property doesn't get to negotiate the terms of its use. Your educational background, which would be vastly superior to any medieval monks, would actually work against you. You'd understand exactly how hopeless your situation was, how far you were from home, how unlikely rescue would be. A medieval person might maintain hope through faith or ignorance. You'd be trapped with the knowledge that no one even knows you're missing, much less where to look for you. The psychological trauma would be devastating. Modern people aren't prepared for the casual cruelty of medieval life. We live in a world where violence is aberrant, where cruelty is pathological, where suffering is seen as a problem to be solved rather than a condition to be endured. But in the medieval world, violence is normal, cruelty is functional, suffering is the default state of existence for most people. Your contemporary moral framework would provide no guidance for navigating a world where might literally makes right, and mercy is a luxury that few can afford. You'd probably have a complete psychological breakdown before the ship even left English waters. The combination of physical trauma, existential terror, and cultural shock would shatter your modern mind like glass hitting stone. Even your advantages would become disadvantages. Your literacy, which might make you valuable as a slave, would also make you acutely aware of how completely cut off you were from everything familiar. You could read, but not in languages that mattered. You could write, but had no way to send messages. You could calculate, but mathematics wouldn't help you break iron chains. Your knowledge of history would be particularly cruel. You'd know that. The Viking Age lasted for centuries, that raids like this one were common, that there was no cavalry coming over the hill to rescue you. You'd understand that slavery was a fundamental part of medieval economics, that millions of people lived and died in chains, that your individual suffering was just a tiny part of a vast system of exploitation. A medieval monk could maintain hope through faith, believing that God would deliver him or at least reward his suffering in the afterlife, but your modern secular worldview would offer no such comfort. You'd see your situation with stark clarity. You were property now, chattel to be bought and sold, worked until you died far from home, among people who would never see you as human. The irony is that your comfortable, safe, modern life would have prepared you for none of the realities of medieval existence. You'd be like a house cat thrown into a wolf pack, technically the same species, but so far removed from natural conditions that survival would be impossible. Brother Ethelred, for all his shock and terror, at least understands the world he's living in. He knows that violence exists, that life is cheap, that suffering is normal. He has mental frameworks for processing brutality and finding meaning in pain. You would have none of those advantages. You'd be facing a Viking raid with nothing but the soft, vulnerable sensibilities of someone who's never known real hardship, real violence, or real despair. You wouldn't last an hour, you'd be lucky to last minutes. The sun is beginning to set. As the long ship continues its journey north, and with the fading light comes a different kind of horror. The growing realization of what lies ahead. The immediate terror of the raid is over, but the long nightmare of slavery is just beginning. You've survived your first day as Viking property, but survival is a relative term. You're alive, but everything that made life worth living has been stripped away. Your identity, your purpose, your connections to everything you hold dear, all of it is gone, replaced by the simple, brutal reality of chains and ownership. Other prisoners are dealing with this realization in different ways. Brother Marcus has retreated into prayer, mumbling the same Latin phrases over and over, like a magical incantation that might somehow undo what's happened. Brother Paul stares at the horizon as if he's trying to will himself back home through sheer concentration. Brother Thomas has stopped crying, but his silence is somehow more disturbing than his tears. Young Thomas has begun the psychological transformation that will either save his sanity or destroy it completely. He's learning to stop thinking of himself as a person with rights and dignity and start thinking of himself as an object with only survival value. It's a horrible adaptation, but it may be the only way to endure what's coming. The Vikings, meanwhile, have settled into the routine
Of a successful voyage. They're relaxed now, confident that they've put enough distance between themselves and any possible pursuit.
Some are sleeping, others are maintaining equipment, a few are fishing off the side of the ship to supplement their food supplies. Their casual attitude is perhaps the most disturbing thing of all. To them, this is just another day at work. They've destroyed a monastery, killed or enslaved everyone they found there, and stolen everything of value, and now they're heading home to spend their profits and plan their next raid. It's business as usual in the Viking world, but for you and your fellow prisoners, this is the end of everything. Your monastery is gone. Your brothers are dead or scattered. Your life's work lies in ashes. Everything you've spent years building, learning and believing has been reduced to rubble and memory. Worse yet, you're beginning to understand that this destruction wasn't accidental or incidental. It was the entire point. The Vikings didn't just want your gold and silver, they wanted to break something sacred, to prove that nothing is safe from their reach, to send a message that would echo across England for generations. Your monastery was chosen not just because it was wealthy, but because it was holy. The psychological impact of destroying a sacred site, of proving that God couldn't protect his own servants, was worth more to the Vikings than any amount of treasure. Terror, as you're learning, is their most valuable export. As night falls and the ship continues its northward journey, you try to imagine what awaits you at the end of this voyage. The slave markets of Dublin or York, where you'll be displayed like livestock for potential buyers to examine. The process of being sold to someone whose language you don't speak, whose customs you don't understand, whose treatment of you will depend entirely on their economic calculations rather than any sense of human decency. If you're fortunate, you might be purchased by someone who values your literacy and education. A wealthy trader who needs a clerk, a lord who wants a tutor for his children, a church that requires someone who can read Latin. These would be relatively comfortable forms of slavery, positions where your skills might earn you better treatment and living conditions, but you might just as easily be sold to a farmer who needs field hands, a craftsman who requires manual labor, or a ship captain who wants strong backs for rowing. Your education would be worthless in these situations, your former status meaningless. You'd be just another pair of hands to be worked until they wore out. The uncertainty is almost worse than the chains. At least as a monk, you knew what each day would bring. Prayers, work, study, community. Now you face a future where every aspect of your existence will be determined by strangers who view you as property rather than a person. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of your situation is how thoroughly it validates the Viking worldview. You spent your life believing in divine protection, sacred sanctuary, and the power of prayer to shield the innocent from harm. The raid has proven all of those beliefs to be illusions. The Vikings live in a world where strength is the only virtue that matters, where violence is the ultimate arbiter of disputes, where might literally makes right. They've just demonstrated the superiority of their philosophy by destroying yours completely. Your God didn't protect you, your prayers didn't save you. Your sacred space was violated as easily as any barn or market stall. This isn't just physical defeat, it's ideological conquest. The Vikings haven't just taken your body, they've shattered your entire understanding of how the world works. Everything you believed about justice, mercy, and divine providence has been proven wrong by the simple expedient of armed men with sharp weapons. As you drift in and out of uncomfortable sleep, chained in the bottom of a long ship, carrying you. Toward a lifetime of servitude, you realize that Brother Aethelred the monk is already dead. He died on the beach at Lindisfarne when the first Viking warrior set foot on English soil. The person who remains, the one who will survive the slave markets and endure whatever comes next, will be someone else entirely. Someone harder, colder, more realistic about the nature of power and the value of human life. Someone who understands that in a world of Vikings, prayer is less useful than an act, and faith less reliable than fear. You've been educated in the most brutal classroom of all, reality. And the lesson you've learned is one that will stay with you for the rest of your life, however long or short that might be. The strong take what they want, the weak suffer what they must. And sometimes there's no difference between the two except the circumstances of birth and the accident of geography. The Viking ships sail on through the dark water, carrying their human cargo toward distant markets and uncertain fates. Behind them the monastery burns, its smoke visible for miles, a signal to all who see it that the age of sanctuary is over. The dragons have come from the sea, and nothing will ever be the same. So here you are, chained in the bottom of a Viking longship, watching the last traces of your former life disappear beneath the dark waters of the North Sea. You've survived your hour in a Viking raid, but survival is a generous term for your current condition. You're alive, but everything that made life meaningful has been stripped away, reduced to ash and memory. The brutal truth is that you never really had a chance. Not you personally, not your monastery, not anyone caught in the path of these professional killers. This wasn't a fair fight or even a real contest. It was a carefully planned business operation carried out by experts against amateurs, predators against prey, wolves against sheep. The Vikings didn't succeed because they were inherently superior human beings. They succeeded because they'd turned violence into a science, refined terror into an art form, and converted human suffering into a profitable industry. They were better at organized brutality than their victims were at organized defense. And in the medieval world, that was often the only equation that mattered. But your story, horrific as it is, represents something larger than just one monastery's destruction or one monk's enslavement. You've witnessed the collision between two worldviews, two ways of organizing human society, two fundamentally different approaches to the question of how people should live together. The monastery represented order, learning, faith, and the belief that civilization could create spaces safe from the chaos of the natural world. The Vikings represented chaos, strength, pragmatism, and the belief that the only real safety came from being more dangerous than your enemies. On this particular day, chaos won. Strength triumphed over faith. Pragmatism defeated idealism. The carefully constructed world of learning and prayer was swept away by men who understood that all the scholarship in the world couldn't stop a sharp axe wielded by someone willing to use it. This isn't to say that the Vikings were right and the monks were wrong. Civilization requires both elements, the builders who create and preserve, and the warriors who protect what's been built. But when those roles become separated, when the builders forget how to fight, and the fighters reject building, you get tragedies like Lindisfarne. Your monastery was destroyed not because it was weak, but because it had forgotten that strength was necessary. The Vikings succeeded not because they were civilized, but because they had never tried to be anything else but dangerous. Both philosophies, taken to extremes, created their own forms of vulnerability. As the ship carries you toward an uncertain future, you might find some grim comfort in knowing that your suffering serves a historical purpose. The destruction of Lindisfarne in 793 AD marked the beginning of the Viking Age, a period that would reshape the entire political and cultural landscape of medieval Europe. Your monastery's destruction wasn't just a local tragedy, it was the opening, shot in a campaign that would bring down kingdoms, create new trade routes, establish new settlements from Iceland to Russia, and ultimately force the entire European world to adapt or perish. The raid you experienced was just the beginning. Over the next 3 centuries, Viking longships would appear on rivers and coasts from Ireland to Constantinople, carrying warriors who had learned the lessons your captors are demonstrating. That mobility, surprise, and carefully applied terror could overcome almost any defense. But the Vikings weren't just destroyers. They were also explorers, traders, and settlers who would establish some of medieval Europe's most important cities. They reached North America 500 years before Columbus established trade routes that connected Greenland to Byzantium and created a maritime empire that stretched across half the known world. The very ships that carry you into slavery are marvels of medieval technology that will inspire shipbuilders for centuries. The navigation skills that brought these raiders to your remote monastery will guide explorers to distant continents. The organizational abilities that made the raid so devastatingly effective will build kingdoms in England, France, and Sicily. Your suffering is part of a larger story, one that will see Viking raiders become Viking kings, Viking settlers become Viking citizens, and Viking culture become permanently woven into the fabric of European civilization. The same people who destroyed your monastery will eventually convert to Christianity themselves, build new monasteries, and create some of medieval Europe's most beautiful art and literature. But that's cold comfort to you, Brother Ethelred, as you sit chained in the darkness, listening to the Vikings sing their rowing songs. You won't live to see the larger historical patterns or understand how your tragedy fits into the grand sweep of medieval history. You'll only know the immediate reality of loss, displacement, and the daily struggle to survive in a world that has shown you exactly how fragile civilization really is. The truth is that you wouldn't have lasted an hour in a Viking raid because no one was supposed to. That was the entire point. These weren't battles in any meaningful sense. They were demonstrations designed to prove beyond doubt that resistance was futile, that sanctuary was an illusion, and that the only safety lay in submission or distance. The Vikings perfected a form of warfare that bypassed traditional military confrontation entirely. Instead of meeting armies in open battle, they struck at the soft targets that armies were supposed to protect. Instead of besieging fortified positions, they attacked undefended monasteries, trading posts, and coastal settlements. Instead of fighting warriors, they terrorized civilians. It was asymmetric warfare centuries before that term was invented, and it was devastatingly effective against. Your monastery fell not because you were weak or unprepared or faithless, but because you were facing an enemy that had evolved beyond your ability to comprehend or counter. The Vikings represented something new in medieval warfare. Professional. Raiders who had turned violence into a systematic, scientific enterprise. They studied their targets, planned their attacks, and executed their raids with military precision. They understood logistics, intelligence gathering, and operational security. They had developed weapons, tactics, and transportation systems specifically designed for rapid assault and quick extraction. Most importantly, they understood that terror was a force multiplier. By creating a reputation for supernatural ferocity, they could achieve victories without fighting. Towns would surrender at the sight of dragon ships. Kings would pay tribute to avoid raids. Entire regions would empty at the rumor of approaching Vikings. This psychological dominance was their greatest weapon, and you, Brother Ethelred, have just become part of it. Your story will be told in whispered conversations from Scotland to Spain. Your suffering will make the next monastery more likely to surrender without resistance. Your capture will demonstrate to other potential victims that not even God's servants are safe from Viking fury. In dying as Brother Ethelred the monk and being reborn as chattel property, you've become a walking advertisement for Viking effectiveness. Every day you spend in chains, every year you labor for foreign masters, every moment you remember what you've lost will serve as testimony to the futility of resistance and the totality of Viking victory. This is why you wouldn't have lasted an hour in a Viking raid, not because you were personally inadequate, but because the entire system was designed to make survival impossible for people like you. The raid wasn't just an attack on your monastery, it was an attack on the very idea that peaceful, scholarly, faithful communities could exist without the protection of violence. The Vikings proved that in a world of iron and blood, books and prayers were luxury items that could only be afforded by those strong enough to defend them. Your learning, your devotion, your entire way of life were revealed to be dependent on the sufferance of men who recognize no authority but force. As the longship continues its journey through the dark water, carrying you toward a future of servitude and sorrow, you might reflect on the bitter irony of your situation. You devoted your life to preserving knowledge, but the most important lesson you've learned can't be found in any book. The lesson is this: civilization is always just one raid away from barbarism. Peace is always just one invasion away from war. Safety is always just one dragon ship away from terror. The Vikings didn't destroy your monastery because they hated learning or despised faith. They destroyed it because they could, and because doing so served their purposes. In their world, might made right, strength determined survival, and the weak existed only to serve the strong. You've learned this lesson in the most brutal way possible, and it will stay with you for whatever remains of your life. Every morning, when you wake in chains, every evening when you sleep on straw, every moment when you remember what you've lost, you'll know exactly why you wouldn't have lasted an hour in a Viking raid, because you were never supposed to. The dragons came from the sea, and everything changed. Your hour was up before it even began. And somewhere in the distance, carried on the wind, you can still hear the sound of burning monasteries and the echo of Viking war songs, reminding you that the age of sanctuary is over and the age of the sword has begun. The strong take what they want, the weak suffer what they must. And tonight, as every night, from now until the end of your days, you'll know exactly which category you belong to. Sleep well, Brother Ethelred. Tomorrow you'll wake
Up as someone else entirely if you wake up at all.